Hello, welcome to Ancient Jesus Future Faith. I'm Tana and I'm here as usual with Sarah Minardi.
Hello.
And Don Sheaver.
Hey.
And, well, first of all, how are you guys doing this morning?
Great.
Yeah?
Yep. Excited to be recording again.
Good.
I'm swell.
You're swell. And Sarah has her coffee, so that means she's ready to go. All right, so this week we're going to be talking about the question of loving our neighbor. And to get us started with that, I'm going to read from Matthew 22, 34 to 40. And, well, I guess I'll just read it. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the laws and prophets." And in case it wasn't clear, the he in this passage is Jesus. So got my Sunday school answer in right away.
Jesus.
Jesus?
It's Jesus with a he. It's Jesus.
Oh, wow. We're starting with the bad jokes already. All right. So I wanted to start with this because this is I would say for me anyway, this is the verse or the passage that I think of the most when talking about loving your neighbor. This is the one that first comes to mind. I know there are others, but I wanted to start with asking first what you had been told about this passage in the past, or anything that this means, or just what are the kind of layers that have already been put on an interpretation of this for you? Sarah, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's always been presented as like, how dare the Pharisee ask Jesus a question or test him or like that in a negative light. And in terms of like the love your neighbor as yourself, thinking that about how those two ideas are the big ideas that in an overarching way encompass what Torah is teaching us to do. So those are a couple of things. And then also sometimes people going off onto tangents about love your neighbor as yourself, and the tangent of, well, you have to love yourself first and taking care of yourself, and because that's not easy for everybody.
Right.
So
right.
Those are three totally different and random thoughts that come to mind from this passage.
Thanks, Sarah. Don, did you have any thoughts?
So, along with the ones that Sarah mentioned, I'd say probably I just haven't been taught anything about it, right? Like no guidance whatsoever. And kind of as Sarah alluded, this idea of, well, I don't even know what it means sometimes to love myself. And so if that is the standard by which I love my neighbor, it becomes complicated. And me being someone who tends to love to ponder lots of things and get philosophical, I can get mired in that. So yeah, I think one of the things that's surprising to me about this passage is, as you said, Sarah, this is, bringing the Torah down to these two verses, and then for me not to actually be told anything about them growing up, right? Like we never explored Deuteronomy 6 as a church. We never explored Leviticus 19 as a church to understand these passages and how that these two were the consolidation of all the commands of God into this amazing 2-verse sequence. And instead was often left with the idea that to love my neighbor was to do basic yard work for them. So that's so I don't know if that's all that helpful. It's more so just that I wasn't really taught anything about it.
That's interesting because I've asked other people the same thing, and they've said similar things. Like, I don't know, I haven't really been taught much.
Yeah, people
about
quote that verse a lot.
Right.
That verse is mentioned a lot, but to actually be someone to actually go on into any kind of detail in talking about it, it's remained very, applicational, but very simplistic applicational.
Yeah, I would say for me, the thing that I heard the most was what you said about like, oh, loving your neighbor means raking their leaves or, shoveling their driveway or whatever. And that, I think that qualifies as what you were talking about it being simplistic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that because we use the word neighbor to mean the people who physically live next to us, that's like our first thought is like our actual neighbors next to us. So expanding that to include the people who cross our paths throughout our day. And my husband and I have worked in relationship counseling / coaching for a while, and thinking of your significant other as a neighbor in terms of this verse is something that we would refer to, is that your significant other is your first neighbor, taking care of that relationship if you're married or in a committed relationship, because there can be a tendency, especially I feel among Christians, to serve and sacrifice for the church or the activities that the church has going on, and to pour yourself out into that, and neglect what's happening in the home or in the marriage relationship or any committed relationship. And those, to me, those are like the foundation, because it's somewhat easier to go out of the home and serve and like do all your wonderful things. But if you can't be truly loving in that that place of the home, then there's still a lot of growth to happen, if that makes sense. Like in some ways, it's harder to love the person right in front of you than to love like the masses, or just to go out and to accomplish things, to actually get into that deep dive of relationship work and accept somebody and all their faults, and the good and the bad, and living with them 24/7. If you're living with somebody, it's a lot more difficult, intricate work than going out and raking somebody's lawn, or even going out and attending Bible studies. And sometimes, I think to a fault, the church can call people into so much activity that they don't have that time to invest in their relationships with their significant others, or if they have kids, just the quiet moments of investing in their kids as well. So
it's interesting, because I think there's also, you're talking about this intricacy of having your committed relationships, in particular a marriage. I think there's also sort of an interesting sort of opposite effect in a way, where we can make loving people outside and like treating them a certain way more important, and then we're home, and so we're comfortable, and so maybe we're not as kind to our immediate family, or you know what I mean?
It's also just not as much of a social faux pas to kind of battle with your family, right?
Right, yeah.
To be in argument or be short or whatever, because it's more acceptable than if you're out and about with people and you don't know them extremely well or whatever. To be short with them is uncouth.
Right.
So,
which is an interesting. I'm sorry. I was just gonna say that's just an interesting little conundrum. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, because I think if we think of neighbor as the person who's in our path currently, that it can be more challenging, but it's incredibly beautiful, and it's, I think, like where we personally have the most growth, that we encounter parts of ourselves that need to mature and parts of ourselves that need to grow up and things in those close friendships and relationships. Yeah. And if the friendships and the relationships are always just pushed to the side because I need to go do the work of the Lord, well, you're missing some of the work of the Lord.
Right.
I think.
Yeah, you're missing the point.
Yeah.
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 That's a great point. So I have a question about this passage. It starts off by saying, when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. So I looked up the passage prior to this one, and it's talking about the resurrection. It says, that same day, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. And Jesus goes on to answer them about the resurrection. So my question is about the Pharisees versus the Sadducees here. The Pharisees, it says when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. So like, was that them jumping on an opportunity? Was there a difference in opinion between these two? What? Actually, let's back up. What are Pharisees and what are Sadducees? Let's start there.
Would you like me to take it?
Sure.
So it's basically just two different approaches to faith, much like we have Baptists and we have, Catholics, right? That they're unique in the way that they think about God. They have some of their own views that don't align with each other. And one of the major ones is over a physical resurrection. So Sadducees did not typically, I would say, hold to the idea that there would be a resurrection of all people. Okay. That there was no world to come, I believe, was also part of their package. And that they primarily only were engaged with Torah. Anything beyond Torah would have been not as meaningful, if even accepted at all.
So not even the prophets or...
Correct.
Okay.
So they were Torah only for the most part. So it's similar to like Protestants reject, maybe even unknowingly, a lot of Catholic canonized books in the Bible. Same way Sadducees versus Pharisees. So then Pharisees believed in a resurrection. Pharisees believed in all of the Hebrew text, so all the Tanakh. So when Jesus is having a debate with the Sadducees about resurrection, that makes sense that he would, especially since he himself is a Pharisee. I guess I'm stating that too strongly. It has never been stated that Jesus is a Pharisee, but Jesus's behaviors, what Jesus teaches, what Jesus behaves within, is very much Pharisaic standards.
Gotcha.
Anything you want to add to that, Sarah?
No.
I think that that's clarifying, and I think that there are people who would gasp at you saying Jesus was a Pharisee.
Only because they like to use Pharisee as a swear word.
Right. It's their. Yeah, we tend to see them negatively. So then, what was the point of asking this question to test Jesus?
Based on what I just said?
Either that, or if you have a different answer.
Well, read the beginning of this section.
When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him.
And then what was the question?
Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?
Okay, so because he is teaching and has condemned, or not condemned, but has silenced the Sadducees, he's now being asked to articulate an idea that they would then be able to affirm or reject themselves. And so they're wanting Jesus to demonstrate his Phariseeism, I would argue.
Interesting.
Right? Because he just shot down. Like, it's not like you're registered, like,
Yeah.
So you have to kind of discover where people are in their thinking.
Well, doesn't that still happen today?
And like, in what way?
Like, I think among Christians today, especially in the times that we're in, there's so many assumptions made about what people believe and conversations. I mean, I have felt put on the spot, or people trying to feel out what do you exactly believe about controversial topics, or even just running into people and their first question is, are you going to church? Or
Right.
are your mom and dad going to church? Or is it a Bible believing church? All these things that they want to check off to make sure that you're okay.
Yeah.
It almost feels like a moment like that. Like, okay, well, tell us what you're really about. Or
Interesting.
are you in or out?
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. For some reason, when you said that, I didn't quite go as generic as Christian. I was like thinking like, we already do that by saying I'm a Baptist or I'm a Lutheran or I'm evangelical, whatever. We already kind of label that. But I guess, yes, you are absolutely correct. When people just know that you are a believer or you're a Christian or you're whatever other term fits in that. Yes, they ask questions in order to test us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is very common. So for anyone who feels that Pharisees here were doing something detrimental, it would be no different than you or I if we're meeting with someone and they say that they're a person of faith and we say, oh, that's amazing. Where do you go to church? Mm-hmm. Right? Or what is your background? We're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Right.
We're getting an understanding of how they view the world and view the text.
So his answer is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. So would that answer have been radical to the Pharisees? Would it have satisfied them? What would the listeners at that time have understood from this answer?
Does the text say anything about their response?
The people?
Just the Pharisees. How did they respond? How does the interaction end? And then we'd also want to check it in the other Gospels to see. Because their reaction is going to be an indicator of whether or not it's radical.
Well, in one of the Gospels, doesn't it go into the what is labeled as the Good Samaritan?
Yes. Yes. In Luke, it goes into the Good Samaritan. It doesn't here in Matthew. But in Luke, it says, but wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? So that's what happens next in Luke.
Right. So this is where we have to understand and read the entire text, read what happens afterwards, everything. Right. To just stop after a verse is rarely going to be helpful to us. As far as whether or not it was controversial or a huge statement, what I would say is it was a uniquely beautiful teaching from Jesus, because what Jesus does is he combines the first three Hebrew words of two different passages and then basically says, because these three words align, I'm connecting these three words, and makes a really incredible teaching that I think other sages or rabbis would have really respected this connection of these two passages. And as far as I know, those two passages were never connected prior to Jesus's teaching here. So I think as far as radical in the theology, no. But amazing connection between two passages in the text, yeah.
And what two passages are you talking about?
Deuteronomy 6, which is the Shema, the prayer that Israel would do every night before they lie down, every morning when they rise up. And then Leviticus 19. So these two passages are being connected because it starts with love the Lord your God, right? And then it says love your neighbor as yourself. And the Hebrew there is very, very similar. And so he combined these two because they begin the same way. And it's very awesome. It's something that sages and rabbis do constantly. So,
and maybe the Pharisee was expecting possibly an exact commandment to be the answer. Maybe this was a conversation that they would have among themselves, as what commandments were important. I mean, I guess they thought all the commandments were important, but
yeah,
for him to step back and give an overarching answer that encompasses the entire law and the prophets is really cool.
Yeah, and a lot of times people's argument would be, if you asked someone, what is the greatest commandment, other than those of us now that would immediately think of this teaching, it probably would have been, you shall have no other gods before me.
Right.
Would have been considered the
'Cause it was
epitome.
the first one.
Or God is one, which is what Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy 6. So those two would have probably been the competing two answers would be my guess, right? And so Jesus is sharing what he thinks his view is, and then attaching Leviticus 19 to it kind of then doesn't allow it to be done in isolation. Do you see what I'm saying? Like a lot of Christianity, one of the things that I've found to be disappointing about Christendom is you can be a perfectly good Christian by yourself in a room, never interacting with another human being. Because we've made Christianity so individual and so much just a thought process or a heart process. I believe Jesus to be the Son of God. Whatever we might use in an altar call, we can come to those conclusions and those determinations by ourselves without anybody else around us. And most churches would say, that's all you need.
Yeah.
Within Judaism and with Jesus's response here, it is not possible to go throughout life without engaging somebody else. This forces communal behavior, which is really powerful. So Jesus is actually saying, no, the way you love God is by the way that is demonstrated in the way that you consistently and put in effort and desire to love your neighbor. So I think Jesus's point is more controversial to your question, Tana, to modern Christians than it would have been to ancient Jews.
Yeah, and I remember probably a couple months ago now teaching on the Torah portions, and the Torah portion for that week happened to include a genealogy. And my first instinct was like, oh, genealogy, let's skip over that and find something else to talk about.
And please, let's not try to read it out loud.
But then I started looking into it and thinking about it and really drawn to it. And I discovered that was a rabbinic tradition, kind of like a counter rabbinic idea that I think the counter one was like loving God and loving your neighbor, maybe being like really important to understanding the Torah. But another rabbi argued that like the genealogies are the most important piece. And the idea was that because the genealogies remind you that this is your ancestry and you're connected to these people and you're a part of this, and alluding to the fact that you're the link to the future. And when you know that ownership into that genealogy, then you know who your neighbor is, and that the genealogies encourage loving your neighbor in the end.
That's interesting.
Which I really thought was a beautiful take on the genealogies, and trying to place myself into that position of, if I was hearing these genealogies read out loud, and it just became much more beautiful to me to imagine being closer to that historically, and hearing these names and hearing that I'm part of this story. And even when we were talking about it in church, it's like our church has its own little genealogy of the people in it, and the people in it make it. And we even just started reading off the names on that Sunday of the people who are in our community. And it's just such a sense of joy to think of all those individuals and that you're part of something, and these are the neighbors I love, and these are the people who've loved before me, and I'm carrying this into the future. So I thought that was a really beautiful and fascinating way to view the genealogies, which are sometimes quite dry.
And difficult to pronounce.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. In fact, when we first started the church, Dust in Blacksburg, one of the things that happened as people graduated from the discipleship process, we would create two framed entities, one that we would give to the person that was discipled, and then one that we would keep in the church, and it was hung on the wall. And what that did was kind of show the story of the discipleship within our church, and it would have not just all these, it was like word clouds of all the characteristics of everyone in the church describing this person. Like, what are the characteristics of this person? So there's this word cloud around their name. And then it would have the date that they graduated. And it would also then have who it was that discipled them, to kind of create or attempt to create this genealogy mindset of about a history. So having a church plant that was already trying to create a history was kind of a fun and beautiful thing to us.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Probably something we should return to.
Yeah.
We moved and, I got lazy and
I came across those yesterday as I was cleaning up, and I just was looking through them, remembering, and it was nice. It was kind of cool to see the descriptors of each person.
Yeah, maybe we'll get some permission from a couple of the folks that went through discipleship, and we can put a picture of that up on our Facebook page or Instagram, so people could see kind of how we remembered that.
Yeah, we can check that out.
That's beautiful.
So Tana,
Yeah.
I don't know if it was in your plans or not, but if it wasn't, then I'd like to see if I can approach you to have it in the plans.
Yes, because I am the ruler of all.
That's true.
It seems good to Don and the Holy Spirit to move on.
It seems good to Don and the Holy Spirit to not comment on that. Okay, so I want to read Leviticus 19.
Yeah.
Because I think that a lot of us are more familiar with Deuteronomy 6. And the only thing we know from Leviticus 19 is that it sits squarely between two of the Bible thumping passages that have caused harm to the LGBTQ community. So let me read Leviticus 19, and I'm just going to read the first several verses here. So it begins, it says, "The Lord said to Moses, speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Each of you must respect your mother and father, and you must observe my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make metal gods for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. When you sacrifice a fellowship offering to the Lord, sacrifice it in such a way that it will be accepted on your behalf. It shall be eaten on the day you sacrifice it or on the next day. Anything left over the third day must be burned up. If any of it is eaten on the third day, it is impure and will not be accepted. Whoever eats it will be held responsible because they have desecrated what is holy to the Lord. They must be cut off from their people." Now, up until now, we're like, okay, that feels very Leviticus, right? Like, and that just gave me
Leviticus.
Yes, so Leviticus.
But the best is yet to come.
Right, and so those first 8 verses we chalk up to being Leviticus. So, but starting here is where we start to get the idea of what is intended by loving your neighbor. So in verse 9 it says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not deceive one another. Do not swear falsely by my name." And by the way, name here means character or reputation. So do not swear falsely by my reputation, and so profane the reputation of your God. I am the Lord. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. I want to come back to that verse. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Keep my decrees. So one of the things I think that's important for understanding this is by reading Leviticus 19, particularly verses 9 through 18, is that this is actually laying out the different ways in which we love our neighbor. And it's way more significant than the ways that we often do it. Now, there are certain things, such as not lying and not stealing, that, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But there are other pieces in here that are making sure that there's enough food left in your own field for your neighbor to access if need be. That there's also important for us to make sure that their voice is heard regardless of how powerful or how unpowerful they are. So there's just so many really beautiful things in here. And I just think that's important for us to understand that the text actually does tell us how to love our neighbor and doesn't leave it this mysterious thing that we have to figure out what that means. But instead, just like in Deuteronomy 6, if we continue reading through that, we're going to find a more profound explanation for what Jesus says as two of the two great commandments are found in reading out more than just the single verse that he's quoting.
Yeah, and when you were reading through it, it stuck out to me that the language of neighbor is used repeatedly. And then in verse 17, I think your translation said your fellow Israelite.
Yeah.
Which just made me imagine that neighbor is a broader term than just your Israelites. So we're not just talking about taking care of the people like you, taking care of your own. We're talking about taking care of everybody around you.
Absolutely.
And then when it refers to the Israelite, it goes into the verses that are closest to loving your neighbor, and it's about holding a grudge. It's about the relationships between Israelites. So it's like turning like a kind of an inward focus to the people, presumably that you're closest to, like your family. My translation even says your brother in place of Israelite. And in looking at this, it just strikes me because I don't really think loving your neighbor, or I tend to think of the outward actions like we talked about in the beginning, breaking your leaves, or even some of the things you just said, like leaving your fields or giving. But this is about the internal, these last few verses, where it says to rebuke your neighbor, or do not harbor hatred. So not harboring a grudge, rebuke your neighbor directly, or bringing it up and having those difficult conversations so that you're not harboring anger and bitterness. And that is a way that you love your neighbor as you're loving yourself. So you're actually loving yourself when you clear the air and approach these things and not just stuff it down or avoid it.
Absolutely.
Right.
So kind of to what you're saying about your fellow Israelite, I think it's important for us to mention, I briefly kind of alluded to 18 and 20 here, because what's important for us to understand is 18 and 20 have nothing to do with sexuality, first and foremost. So we can go into that in another podcast, too big to go into at this moment. But 18 and 20, so listen to the way 18 begins. It says, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. And so what's being implied here is the way that they worship. Right? This is being written to the Levites. The Levites are the ones that are in charge of temple worship and tabernacle worship. And God is telling the Levites that they are not allowed to do worship practices the same way as the neighboring countries or empires or kingdoms, whatever it might be at the time. Because one of the things that was very common, particularly when it came to idol worship, which we know was mentioned in 19, is some of these really horrible sexual practices that were extremely harmful to people and were about power and were very much sexual assault and rape in the land that it was being practiced within. And God's saying, even though you're surrounded, just like these two chapters are surrounding 19, even though you are surrounded by this behavior from Egypt, where you left, and Canaan, where you're going, you do not have my permission to live this way. In fact, let me tell you what my practices are I want you to do. I want you to still love them, I want you to still make sure they have food. But I also want you to be reminded, and this solves some of the weirdness of Leviticus 19, where it's like, why can't we mix two different types of
Right.
material in a garment? Because it's a metaphor for what God is saying. Be careful, because if you begin to mix in your practices for worship gathering and the Canaanite practices for worship, it's going to tear the garment. And that's bad. Do not tear the garment. That doesn't give you permission to not leave the corners of your field. That doesn't leave you permission to not make sure that justice is upheld. But do not plant both seeds in the same field, because it'll destroy everything. Does that make sense? And so it's not so much about a literal, you can't wear, polyester. It's more so about this idea that if you start bringing in foreign practices into your relationship with God, it is going to taint it. Which part of the reason we talk about ancient Jesus here is because some of my views that I hold is that as more and more pagans, Gentiles, came into Christianity and pushed Judaism and the Jewish leaders out, they brought in pagan practices into Christianity, which have become harmful over the last 2,000 years. Got harmful pretty quickly because we went quickly into the Crusades. We went quickly into some things and some behaviors that were extraordinarily harmful. And in fact, we abandoned the idea of, even though our surroundings are practicing a faith in a different way than us, that we should still be neighborly to them. Instead, we threatened to kill them if they didn't convert.
Right.
So this passage is so important, and Jesus is talking about this and reviewing or referring to Leviticus 19 is so significant when understood in the context of 18 and 20 and what's going on. And imagining Jesus saying this while Israel is occupied by Rome and the pantheon of gods, and the way that they are being worshipped is surrounding all the Israelites. And Jesus is reminding them, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. And don't get it twisted with these other gods. But that doesn't give you permission to hate the Romans. That doesn't give you permission to not be just in the way you behave. It's super powerful.
Yeah.
It's also not telling them to just take it either. They're not being asked to be doormats either.
And
Yeah.
So just to clarify what you're saying about, not hating other nations, you're saying that's embedded within Leviticus, or you're saying that's what Jesus is saying?
Both.
Both.
Yes.
Okay, because I was, when you were reading Leviticus, and then kind of based on some of what you said, Sarah, I was thinking about how what Jesus quoted here starts with what, I don't think it actually says it here, but the passage, I believe, in Deuteronomy starts with "Hear, O Israel," right?
Yes.
And
That's
then,
what Shema means, is here.
right? And then you were saying about how your passage of Leviticus, or your translation of Leviticus 19 said "fellow Israelite," and so then that made me wonder if that's why the lawyer was like, "Well, who's my neighbor?" Because what Jesus was quoting was all about it. I was wondering if they would have heard it at that time as only being about Israel.
No.
Yeah, okay.
No, because of where it sits between 18 and 20.
Okay.
But I do think the person asking Jesus, then who is my neighbor, is trying to suss this out in saying, Rome is pretty brutal. Look around. As much as we want to imagine that there were only 3 crosses up on a hill, and one of
Right.
them was bigger than the other 2, and there was a nice sunset behind it. These crosses were along the road, reminding the Jewish people of their place within Israel, which was, you're at their mercy,
Right.
right? Which is ironic then when Jesus says, your neighbor's the one who shows mercy. And because you're at the mercy of Rome, and I don't blame the Pharisees for wanting to understand this. They're basically saying, are you telling us that we have to be kind, that we have to seek justice for those who oppress us? Is that what you're telling us? Because Jesus saying this, Leviticus would have been very well known at the time of Jesus that this was about being surrounded by Egypt and Canaan, one on each side, and how you are supposed to live in the midst of those things. And so, yeah.
Interesting.
It makes it really powerful, in my opinion.
Well, I think what's really beautiful about that is just knowing that at that time, the depth of knowledge people would have had, they would have heard all of that.
Right, but we're afraid of the book of Leviticus, or we're afraid of Torah. We have a weird anti-Torah, which I would argue is part of that whole pagan influx into Christianity that put us opposed to the Hebrew Bible,
Right.
as opposed to grafted in to the Hebrew Bible, as Paul would say.
Well, and I think it's also a misunderstanding of, the verse where Jesus says he has come to fulfill the law.
Sure, we'll have to get on that in another episode, though.
Yeah. And because I've heard people say, oh, well, Jesus abolished the law. He got rid of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a whole thing. But it also just makes me think, too, how even like referring to it as the Old and the New Testament is a man-made placement upon
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
text.
Absolutely.
And there's connotations, at least, that a Western lens kind of can...
Out with the old, in with the new.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of... I kind of like referring it to as the First and the Second Testaments as opposed to Old and New.
Yeah, I just try to say the text says, regardless whether I'm talking about the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible, or I'll say the Hebrew Bible or Torah, or what have you. Tanakh is another good way to say it.
I was just going to say, isn't it also called the Tanakh? I'll sometimes say the Tanakh. And then people don't know what I'm talking about. So.
The Pentateuch?
Yes.
There's
The Pentateuch is the Torah.
The first 5
That's what I
books.
thought. Okay, I thought it was just those 5, but I wasn't sure. But Tanakh is like the whole thing, right?
Yes, because it stands for the Torah, the prophets, the wisdom literature. And when you combine the first few letters of each of those Hebrew terms referencing that, it becomes Tanakh.
Gotcha. Okay.
Wow, we've now broadened the spectrum of this conversation so far.
Yeah, it's but it's good. It's all good. It's all useful information, I think, for understanding scripture. And I think sometimes, like even my question about the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the beginning, I think some people would probably be like, why is that important? Yeah. Why do you need to know that? Or they wouldn't have even thought to ask it.
Yeah.
So to the Pharisees and Sadducees question, it's, if you remember Paul when he's dragged in front of the Sanhedrin, which is made up of Pharisees and Sadducees, what Paul does that's brilliant is he's being brought in because he's been teaching Jesus, and it's causing a problem with Israel's position within Rome, right? And so he's brought before the Sanhedrin, which is made up of Pharisees and Sadducees, as I said, and the Pharisees basically say, Paul, why are you here? And instead of Paul saying, because I'm teaching Jesus, Paul says, because I believe in the resurrection, which immediately puts the Pharisees and Sadducees into a fight with each other.
Interesting.
Because if Paul's convicted and found to be guilty because he's teaching resurrection, now he was teaching specifically the resurrection of Jesus, but he reduces it to, because I've been teaching resurrection. The two sides start fighting, and there seems to be this battle happening with them, and they're like, just leave, Paul, just get out. And then they fight amongst themselves, and it's this unbelievably brilliant maneuver by Paul. So again, why we understand or why we need to know the culture and context becomes really significant as we study the text.
Yeah, I kind of love that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's just
he just
such
walks in, he's like, all right, I'm just gonna make them fight with each other, and then I'm gonna sneak out the back.
Oh, it's absolutely brilliant. It's one of my favorite moments in the text that you just, unless you know the culture and context, you just think, I don't even know what you think.
Yeah.
Because you just read that passage and you're like, okay, so Paul's not in trouble anymore?
Happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important to understand. Yeah, totally why it's so important to understand the culture and the context, because there's so much, that's so much richer
Yeah.
And also hilarious.
Yeah. So now that we have some culture and context around Leviticus 19 and around what Jesus was saying, Sarah, like, how does this, and obviously we're talking about like a 5-minute window since we talked about this, and some of this stuff I know you already knew, but how does that impact the way that you think about loving your neighbor?
The Leviticus section, you mean?
Just now that we've put in place some more of the culture, the context, some more of the understanding of the Leviticus sitting between 18 and 20 and sitting between Egypt and Canaan, like, because at the beginning you shared the 3 things that were the typical layers that were put on this, and so I know, like I said, I know you've known some of this already. So what has shifted in you about understanding loving your neighbor over the years, or that you've come to it through studying the text?
Yeah, I think mostly just a broader understanding of what neighbor means. So of who fits into that neighbor category, that it's not just literally the person who lives next door to me. It's the people closest to me. It is the people next door to me, but it's also around the world, being concerned about what's going on in the world, being concerned about justice and fairness and love and care being shared in all those realms, whether it's the person right in front of me who's asking for money, who needs a little help, or it's somebody across the world and who needs help that it just seems worlds away. But developing more, for me personally, an awareness of what's going on in other parts of the world, and having compassion for that, and getting out of my own little safe little bubble of where I am. I think it's, as much as in the beginning I was emphasizing that, like, most closest of relationships, it doesn't stop there. So I'm glad you asked this question, because it is that most closest of relationships for me, for my husband and my daughters, and taking care of them. It's also literally taking care of our neighbors who live in our neighborhood and keeping an eye out for their needs and caring for them. And then it broadens out from there to our city, to our world. And it's a wonderful reflection that to stop and think, like, how are my priorities influencing all these circles? And when I say priorities, I think, how is my money being spent? How is my time being spent to love all those neighbor groups well? I mean, and it is impossible. It's impossible to be on top of every piece of information and every need around the whole world. And I think that's like why we have community, and why it's so beautiful to see when people are passionate about certain issues. And because I just imagine that God gives people little fires of passion about topics so that they will speak about it, and that they'll bring other people awareness, because we as one person can't know everything that goes on. So I love hearing about the passion of people and supporting them in that, even though I can't, as one person, impact everything around the entire world. So that's kind of like the practical way that my husband and I try to live it out in our lives.
Yeah. What about you, Tana?
So I think for me, the thing that has been most transformative in my thinking about, loving your neighbor is the passage that we kind of mentioned and we don't really go into, which is typically labeled the Good Samaritan. And Sarah, maybe you can explain why I just said the phrase typically labeled the Good Samaritan.
Yeah, and I think we touched on this idea when I was talking about the Old and the New Testaments, of things that get added to the text after the text was, oral tradition written and all that. But yeah, these chapter headings and how they can kind of throw us off.
Chapter headings. That's what I could not remember.
Or pericopes.
What?
Is pericopes what it is when it's divided within the chapter?
Yes.
Because as soon as I said chapter heading, I'm like, I don't exactly know if this is where a chapter break happens off the top of my head. But these little headings that happen throughout the text that aren't part of the text, and that there can be connotations associated with that. I mean, that those headings are in themselves an interpretation. And if we read those before we read the text, it can kind of cloud or influence what we look for in the text. It's kind of like, it's like being at the eye doctor and they put a new lens in front. There's one of those lenses. They slid a lens in there. So this one is often labeled in the translations as the Good Samaritan because it involves a Samaritan. So yeah, I'd love to delve into this story a little bit more of this. So Jesus follows up the love your neighbor with telling and the story of the Good Samaritan. And we have, is it a priest and a Levite who walk by, and then a Samaritan walks by, and somebody who's been robbed and injured and left to the side of the road. The Samaritan then helps the person, bandaging them up, putting them on their donkey, I believe, and carrying them to the next town, taking them to the inn, providing for their needs, giving money to the innkeeper so that they can be taken care of. And after telling this parable to Jesus then asked which one was a neighbor. Mm-hmm. And as Don has taught me that when you read a parable, if there's nothing surprising or shocking about it, then you're missing something. Mm. So most likely it's historical context or references or humorous things that aren't humorous to us because we're just coming with our own lens and our own understanding. But the idea that the priest and the Levite, who, as we've been talking about, the Torah talks about taking care of your neighbor, that they would walk by somebody in need, and then a Samaritan who, in this time, the relationship with the Samaritans was strained and would not be the expected hero of this story. They're the ones who show care and love to this person who's injured, and that's what Jesus is presenting in this parable.
That was a great summary. I was following because I have it pulled up in front of me, and I was following along. I'm like, yes, she got that. She got that. So awesome.
Great.
Do you have anything to add, Don?
Yeah, I think just to kind of emphasize a couple points that Sarah made is, the way that I've heard this taught is oftentimes to bag on the purity laws, mm-hmm. or on the Levite and the priest being legalistic and the way that they're handling this. And this becomes then an anti-Jewish or anti-Judaism passage as opposed to what it really is, which is a pro-neighbor passage. And I just want to, our audience to understand that Jesus's audience, when he says this person is beat up, left alongside the road, he's been robbed, all these horrible things happen, and the audience hears that a priest is approaching, they're thrilled because the priest is going to be the hero. The priest is going to take care of this human because that's what priests do.
Right.
And the priest walks by and the audience is going to be stunned by this. They're not going to understand what in a million years would have been the reason that a priest would have walked by. They would not have come to the conclusion that we did and we teach, which is, it's all about purity laws. No, they would have just been like, this isn't possible. And then Jesus doubles down and says, and a Levite does the same thing. And the people would have been like, I don't know where this is going.
Right.
Because this makes zero sense to me. And then Jesus picks out a people, the Samaritans, that Israel at this moment, this is where the disciples threaten to call down fire upon in the city that refuses to show Jesus hospitality. This is the Samaritan woman that we meet at the well, that there is conflict between these people. Mm-hmm. And Jesus decides to make the Samaritan the hero. So I just think that it's really powerful because the audience couldn't have imagined any of the three things that happened. They couldn't imagine a priest walking by. They definitely couldn't imagine that if a priest already walked by, that a Levite would also walk by. And then they definitely couldn't believe that a Samaritan would be the person to demonstrate the love and mercy to someone that they anticipated as a given from the priest and the Levite. This is really important. And then on just an aside, I do my best to never call this parable the Good Samaritan. We can call this the parable of the neighbor. We can call this the parable of showing mercy. We can say it's the parable of the robbed, whatever. But the moment we call it the Good Samaritan, it smacks of racism. Mm-hmm. The Samaritans still exist today. They're still on this earth today. And in the same way that we should never say the good and then whatever group we then add to that, we should not call this the Good Samaritan.
As if there's only one good.
As if it's shocking that there is a good Samaritan.
Yeah.
It is very racist. It is a problem. It has been so accepted, and we have so many hospitals called that, and so many things that are actually doing good things named that I'll probably never win this argument within the world. But I would just encourage you to maybe start calling this parable the good neighbor.
Right. Well, and it's ubiquitous to even, if somebody does something nice and they're like, oh, this person was a good Samaritan.
Right.
Yeah.
Which implies that that's shocking.
Right. But I don't, it doesn't carry that meaning for us now of like.
Well, it does. We just because just in saying it, we literally are saying that we're differentiating this Samaritan from all the other ones because this one is good. We don't necessarily have anything against Samaritans today.
That's what I mean.
Okay.
That's just not, I don't think anybody now could name, I couldn't tell you where Samaritans live now.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. But I do think it's important for us to remember that they do still exist. They are still a people.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I might be wrong about this, but doesn't their genealogy trace back to being connected? Like,
well, they're Jewish.
They're Jewish people who were separated when the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom separated.
Yes.
And tracing it down the line. So going back to the genealogy comment, if you actually look back at genealogy, then the Samaritans they were all brothers at one time. So this is a little bit different than Egypt and Canaan. So
here's what I'm gonna suggest, and I have not publicly stated this view before. So yeah, exactly. So to understand the Samaritans, you have to understand that they were part of the northern kingdom of Israel. They were taken over and they were exiled to Assyria. They then mixed garment material and became the Samaritans. In a passage where Jesus quotes Leviticus 19 that talks about being a good neighbor, but do not blend two garments, he then makes the hero of his story a people that blended their garments, so to speak.
Wow.
And I just think that this is super beautiful, super profound, and I haven't written anything down about it yet, or started, making this part of the way that I present this teaching. So here you go.
Patent pending.
Patent pending.
You heard it here, folks. You're exclusive.
That's right. Just keep it between us. But I think that there's something really powerful about that moment where Jesus gets done quoting Leviticus 19, where they would know it sits between Canaan and Egypt, as you just referenced again. And here's a people that didn't do part of Leviticus 19. Now, I would argue they were forced in a lot of ways, and it wasn't really part of their plan. Mm-hmm. But they then become the hero of the story, which would have been shocking for Jesus just to quote Leviticus 19 and then make the hero of the story a people group that Israel believed failed Leviticus 19.
Right.
So anyhow.
Which is really beautiful too.
It is. It's stunning.
Yeah. Wow.
It means we all have a shot because we've all mixed pagan culture with our religion. And we can still be the hero of the story.
Also, I'm sure we have all worn blended garments.
I don't really think that's what the passage is about.
Sorry. Well, I think that's a great place for us to sort of wrap up the conversation. Are there any final thoughts that either of you would like to share? Sarah, do you have any final words of wisdom? No pressure.
Just an encouragement to love your neighbor and let that be a narrow focus and a broad focus, and spend that time in self-reflection to ask yourself, like, how can I show love and mercy and care for all people? And are my day-to-day actions reflecting that love and care for people?
Yeah. Done?
I think for me, just remember, in order to be the hero of the story, it's as simple as showing mercy. That's it.
That's very nice, concise, and awesome.
So then I should stop talking.
Just forever or
Permanently.
just today? Okay. Well, thank you both. I feel like this was such a rich conversation, and I learned a lot, like not just about scripture, but also about some historical things. Like so this was very educational for me. I hope it was educational for everybody listening or watching. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to catch us in between podcast episodes, you can catch us on Twitch on Mondays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern, Ancient Jesus Future Faith, and on our website, ancientjesusfuturefaith.com, or you can email us at info@ancientjesusfuturefaith.com.
I feel like there's a pattern here. Ancient Jesus.
Ancient Jesus Future Faith.
Yeah.
We're also on social under Ancient Jesus Future Faith. Anyway, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.